Clever, tell me after we're done. All right, let's do a quick review, excuse me, from last week. You know that tonight is our penultimate night. So next week is the last Christianity Explored class. So here, last week was our middle, the middle week. And we asked the question, if you died tonight and God asked you why he should let you into heaven, what would you say? What reasons would you give for why he should allow you into heaven? Wrong answers are, I pay taxes, I give blood, I'm better than most people, I never killed anybody, I use my turn signals, right? Or even religious answers that are wrong. I go to church, I even give some money, I read my Bible, I pray a lot, I keep the 10 Commandments, I've been baptized, my parents are Christian. See, Jesus says our problem is from within. It's not something external that we can do to fix us, because the problem is deep inside all of us. Ephesians 2:8 and 9 say, for by grace you've been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it's the gift of God, not a result of works, lest anyone should boast and be like, hey, I'm saved because I'm a pretty good person. I'm better than average. I'm better than most. I'm better than the person sitting next to me. Those aren't good answers. A good answer would have something to do with grace. Maybe something like, you should let me into heaven only because I know and love Jesus. He died the death that I deserved, and he's forgiven me of my sins. Applying this to the story of Jean Valjean from Les Miserables, we saw that justice would have been to lock him up and throw away the key. Moderation, maybe we would say forgiveness, is to say, well, he did steal, but I'm not going to press any charges. But grace is giving him not only allowing him to keep the silverware, but also giving him the candlesticks. And lastly, we saw that what does grace mean for your life? If it's really true that your sins can be forgiven graciously, without you having to do anything, without you having to work for it, what might it mean? Well, a couple things. One is there are no masks to wear. You don't have to pretend anymore. You can be honest with who you really are. In the good things, but also in the bad things. And secondly, there's nothing to prove, because Jesus is the one who gives you full acceptance, full forgiveness. Still my Chick-fil-A, excuse me. This week, we're going to talk about the significance of the resurrection. What is the significance of the resurrection? And I promised you a crazy, amazing, sad, beautiful story, like maybe one of the most incredible you've ever heard. And so here it is. In the year 2006, this is a true story, by the way. In the year 2006, there was a horrible, catastrophic car accident out on an interstate in central Indiana, and the accident took the lives of 5 college students. And some of those college students, or all of those college students, attended my wife's alma mater, which is Taylor University. A few days after the accident, 1,400 people, you got to listen to this, 1,400 people attended the funeral of one of the women who died. Her name was Whitney Sarek. And in the meantime, as that funeral was happening, another family called the Van Rens, they sat at the bedside of their daughter, Laura, who was in a coma. She'd been horribly just beaten up from the accident. Her face was lacerated and all these sorts of things. And 5 weeks after the funeral, gradually, to the horror of the Van Ren family, they realized that the girl who they thought was their daughter was not their daughter. They had been sitting beside Whitney, who had been buried 5 weeks earlier. So in reality, it was their daughter who had been buried 5 weeks earlier.
Let's go through that.
You want me to tell the story again?
Somebody's dead and somebody's alive. What's the deal here?
I can explain it. At the what happened was a 15-passenger van going down the interstate, a semi tractor trailer. The driver fell asleep and just, crushed the 15-passenger van. Bodies and things went everywhere. And what happened was the women, their bags got confused. It was like, okay, this is this person's belonging. Take her to the morgue, take her to the hospital, that kind of thing. And the girls look very, very similar. And
The hospital didn't know who she was.
the hospital, yeah, it was a case of mistaken identity.
Their didn't know.
Her family who was sitting with her didn't know it. It took them weeks to be able to recognize her as she began to heal. Yeah, her face was messed up. That's right. Yeah. But I want you to imagine the call to the Sarek family. Hi, remember your daughter? She's alive, and she's here. She's asking to see you. Whitney's sister wrote, we were told that Whitney was asking for us, and when we saw that she was coherent enough to cry, so we all sat there and cried together, she immediately began to say, let's go home. We spent the day praising God for the resurrection of Whitney. When our dad arrived at the hospital, Whitney grabbed his hand, my mom's hand, and looked at us and sighed like everything was finally all right. So Whitney is doing well today, and in the year 2010, she was married in the church in which she had previously been buried or had her funeral. Now, I think that might be the closest story.
So the other family, the family of this Laura, they think she's still alive and hiding somewhere?
No. So basically, there's a girl who died, and there's a girl who was terribly injured in the accident. They're both at the crime. Yeah, and so they basically swapped them. And so the girl who was buried, they thought was. Right. Yeah. That was what. Yeah. So they.
So the family of the girl who's dead is staying with the other girl. Yeah. They think it's their daughter. Yeah.
They're saying yes, so that sounds right. I didn't follow that, but.
Who's in the hospital staying with the woman who's
The
alive?
wrong family.
Okay, so that's horrible. Yeah.
It's absolutely horrible. Oh yeah, I mean, imagine the joy of knowing your child is alive, your child that you buried 5 weeks earlier, and then on the other hand, the family. It dawned on them that this wasn't their daughter, that the daughter had died weeks before.
So what did they do?
I have never had this many questions about this story. I will answer them though. There was mourning, there was joy, and the families to this day are friends. So the story was, they wrote a New York Times bestseller. They were on Frontline or Dateline, one of those lines, 2020, they kind of had this whole special about this joyful, tragic case of mistaken identity. Well, so I think that's the closest story that I've ever heard of that is akin to a resurrection. Because imagine the family who got their daughter back. And for 2,000 years, Christians have believed that after Jesus was killed, after he was executed on the cross, that he came back to life, that he rose from the dead. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is a belief that is central to the Christian faith. And so this evening, we're going to look at a little bit of evidence. Is there any reason to believe that the resurrection actually happened? That Jesus Christ really is alive? Now, I would argue that the resurrection is so important. It's one of the most important events, if not the most important historical event in all of Christianity. And that's what caused the Apostle Paul, who was one of the early Christians, to write these words in 1 Corinthians 15. If Christ has not been raised, if Christ was not raised from the dead, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins, right? If we're still in our sins, then we're lost, right? There's no hope for us. And maybe the whole thing is just a lie and it's not true. So the Apostle Paul stakes the truth of Christianity on the fact of the resurrection. Now, perhaps the earliest writing in the New Testament, certainly one of the most early, is a letter that Paul wrote to the church, to the Christians at Thessalonica in the year 50 or 51 AD. And he wrote this: "For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so through Jesus God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep, or those who have died." Now, the Apostle Paul wrote this the time frame was within about 15 to 20 years after Jesus Christ rose from the dead. So here's our question this evening. How can we be sure of something that happened or that maybe happened 2,000 years ago? So this is where your fill in the blanks will come in handy. I'm going to give you 3 lines of evidence for why you should believe the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that this actually happened. The first is that Jesus' death was certain. Of course, if Jesus didn't die in the first place, then it would be nonsense to say, well, he rose from the dead, 3 days after he died. So that's the first thing. His death was certain. His tomb was empty. And then thirdly, many claimed to see Jesus alive after he died. So first is that Jesus' death was certain. And the first point here is that his female followers, they watched him die. They witnessed it. So turn with me in your Bibles to Mark chapter 15, starting at verse 39 and 40. As you are turning there, make sure you have one of those question cards, the little small piece of paper. And as you have questions, go ahead and write those down. And then about 5 minutes before I'm done, we'll pass a basket around, and then those can come up to me. And you can ask a question about anything. It doesn't just have to be about the resurrection. So Mark chapter 15, I'll start at verse 39 and 40, and then we'll jump to verse 47. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he, Jesus, breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." You remember that passage? We looked at that. By the way, this is on page 1014 in the Bibles in front of you. And then Mark continues in verse 40. There were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph and Salome. Drop down to verse 47. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. We'll come back to this in a moment, but I will mention that accounts of females were not considered valid in under Roman law. So for a woman to testify that a crime had been committed, that was inadmissible in Roman courts in those days. So keep that in mind. I'll explain that in a little bit more in a few minutes. But I want you to notice that even the centurion, the one who called Jesus the Son of God, he verified indirectly that Jesus had died. Because look at his wording in verse 39. Truly this man, what's the next word? Was the Son of God, right? This guy who just died in front of me, he was the Son of God. Now, no doubt he must have had questions immediately and thought to himself, how could the Son of God die, right? That doesn't make sense. If he's really God, how is it he died? Well, so that's the first thing. His female followers, these women, they watched him die. But notice also that, secondly, Pilate was surprised by Jesus' death. And look with me now at Mark 15, same chapter, verses 42 through 45. And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, that is the Sanhedrin, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Look at this next verse. Pilate, who's not a follower of Jesus, right? He was not a Christian. Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have already died. And summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. Now, some skeptics will claim that Jesus didn't really die. There are all these different theories to try to explain away the Bible's account of what happened, to try to explain away the resurrection. There's even one called the Swoon theory. The idea that Jesus was on the cross and he was just tormented and tortured, and he just kind of like, and just kind of, maybe went into like a short-term coma or something like that, but later he revived and, that sort of thing. I think that doesn't give Roman soldiers enough credit. Roman soldiers were trained as expert murderers. Murderers. This is what they were supposed to do. When the empire told them, execute these criminals, you had better believe it. They knew how to do that. I mean, you're a Roman centurion in training, and you go to your first year of freshman year, you're taking classes like Killing 101, right? I mean, these are the type of classes that they took. So we need to give them a little bit more credit than to think that Romans didn't really know if a person was dead. They absolutely did. They were professional executioners. So notice Pilate here, he's surprised. It was unusual that Jesus died that quickly. Sometimes people could hang out there in the sun for 2 or 3 days before they died. But when you consider exactly what happened to Jesus prior to his going to the cross, it makes it a little bit more understandable. Well, secondly, not just his death was certain, but Jesus' tomb was empty. These are both fill in the blanks. Jesus' friends verified that the tomb was empty. Look with me at Mark 16, verses 1 through 4. Jesus' friends verified that the tomb was empty. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, brought spices so that they might go and, what's the next word? Anoint him. So they're taking something some ointment, and they're taking spices to the tomb of Jesus. What do you imagine are their intentions? What are they going to do? Embalm him, right? Because they feel sure that he is what? Dead. He's still there. We know, and believe it or not, even they knew in their pre-scientific age that when somebody's killed, they're still going to be where you left them a few days before, right? So again, this is a type of detail that you wouldn't include in the account unless if this was actually the truth, right? They took the spices to apply to Jesus' body because they knew he was dead. But look at verse 2. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb, and they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. They learned momentarily that this was an angel. And he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth. He was crucified. He is not here, but he has risen." So notice that in all 4 Gospels, the followers of Christ found the tomb empty. So Jesus' friends, we might say, they attested to the fact that the tomb was empty. But look at this next point. Jesus' opponents also attest to the fact that the tomb was empty. You see how that makes a little bit more powerful case? It's like, well, yeah, of course Jesus' friends are going to say, yeah, we went to the tomb and he was gone. He must be risen. But Jesus' enemies also admitted that the body was gone. The tomb was empty. Look at Matthew, flip back to page 993 in your Bible. That's Matthew chapter 28, verses 10 through 14. Page 993. So at one point after his we'll say at least purported resurrection, Jesus' disciples, they see him and he speaks with them. And let's pick up at verse 10. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, "Tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep." That teaches us to beware of elders, right? Beware of elders. Here's just a basic question for you. Why would they need to make up a story about where Jesus' body went? Why? It was gone, right? The body was gone, and so Jesus' opponents had to fabricate a story. Well, this is why it's gone, because Jesus' disciple, maybe Jesus swooned and he kind of passed out, and then the disciples came and pried away the stone and got him out. Well, then the third line of evidence for the resurrection is that many claim to see Jesus alive after he died. That's the next fill in the blank. To see Jesus alive after he died. Here are just a few examples. One is there's an angel. An angel tells him Jesus is risen. Go back to page 1014, Mark 16, verses 6 through 7. This young man, and again, other accounts tell us that this was actually an angelic person in the form of a human. Read Luke 24 if you doubt that designation, where the women say, "We met two men," and then they go and they tell the disciples, they said, "We met two angels." So you see, the two are connected in Luke. Anyway, in Mark 16, verse 6 through 7, the angel says, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. So they have an appearance of an angel who says, Jesus is risen. Not only is his body gone, but this is where his body has gone. He's left because he's risen. But next, I want you to notice that each gospel records these claims. I alluded to this a moment ago, but let me go into that a little bit more. 11 times the Gospels record that Jesus appeared to both friend and enemy. Some examples of that would be, there's a claim by the Apostle Paul that Jesus appeared not only to the 12 and to Paul, but also to 500 at one time in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. 1 Corinthians is a very early Christian writing that's dated to about the year 55 AD. So we're talking about 25, 30 years, something like that, 20 to 25 years after the resurrection. So the Gospels consistently record this fact. It's true that certain Gospels will highlight one fact or another, or some particular aspect, a particular angle of the story, but the Gospels are unified in their testifying to this event of the resurrection. Here's another one. I find this, as a historian, I find this point absolutely incredible. That in all four Gospels, women were the primary witnesses to the empty tomb, even though their testimony was not valid in court. Folks, you would not, if you're making all this stuff up in the Bible, there is no way on earth you would record that it was women who were the first people to discover the empty tomb. You wouldn't do that, because, as I said a moment ago, it's a fact. I'm sure all of us would agree that is crazy and tragic and horrible, that according to Roman law, a woman could not be trusted to give a worthwhile, accurate reporting of some event. Right? I hope we would all reject that and say that's crazy and horrible. The Romans were that way. But the point here is, you simply would not put this in here unless if this is exactly how it happened. Right? I mean, to even show you how deeply profound this should be to us, is that, as we saw earlier, the Apostle Paul said, if the resurrection didn't happen, Christianity is false. So this is the premier miracle within Christianity. And you're going to stake the main event on the testimony of women whose testimony was inadmissible in court. Again, I mean, do you feel the weight of that? I don't have, have training in certain areas, but my training is as a historian. As a historian, this is gold dust. Like gold dust. It makes it utterly compelling for me that it had to have happened this way, because nobody would have put this in here unless if that's exactly how it happened. Now, lastly, on this point is even scholars who are not Christians, scholars who do not believe the resurrection, they still concede at least three facts. There's unity within New Testament scholars on these points. Jesus died and was buried. His tomb, secondly, was empty. And thirdly, that it is recorded that Jesus was seen alive by hundreds of people. Many of these died for their belief that Jesus was alive. Now, again, these are not Christian scholars who would believe this. Now, Christian scholars believe them too. But what they do with these facts is a different matter, But nevertheless, there's unity on at least these 3 points. Back in the 1800s, there was a professor by the name of Simon Greenleaf. He was a royal professor of law at Harvard. He was skeptical of Christianity. and he was challenged to evaluate the evidence for the resurrection using established principles of evidence. And he concluded, quote, according to the laws of legal evidence, the resurrection of Jesus Christ is proven by more substantial evidence than any other event of ancient history. I think in light of all the evidence that there is, we could make this statement that a person can choose to say they do not believe in the resurrection, but they cannot say that there's not enough evidence. That's really true. I can't even tell you the number of volumes that have been written about this event called the resurrection. Now, let me give you, if you were to ask me, say, all right, Nathan, give me what you think is the most powerful argument for the resurrection. Let me have it. You ready? I'm going to give you what, to me, I just find overwhelmingly compelling. It goes like this. People will die for something that they think is true. Is that true? Yeah. Now, the reality is not many people, right? Not many people will die for something that they really believe with all their heart, but you will find some. Any of you alive in Vietnam, or if you know the history of the Vietnam War, you can probably imagine the Buddhist monks who lit themselves on fire to protest the Vietnam War. It's like, hey, no matter who that monk was, I think we can all concede he really believes it. He lit himself on fire. So it's not often that people will die for something they know is true, but it still happens, right? People will die for something that they believe is true. However, no one will die for something that they know is a lie. It's the case that the early followers of Jesus, especially his disciples, were almost all of them killed for their testimony of who Jesus Christ was. And it's like, if you say that Jesus is Lord instead of Caesar is Lord, and you're telling me that even though the Caesars have been dying, Jesus, your Lord, is alive, that becomes a great political threat to what? The empire. We kill people like that. And it wouldn't take too long. If this was a lie, it wouldn't take too long before they said, all right, we'll come up to this hill and we're going to crucify you, because we're not going to allow any of the Jesus followers to try to spread this anti-Roman message. If this was a lie, can't you imagine what would happen to one of Jesus's followers? They'd be like, whoa, you misunderstood me. I certainly didn't mean that he literally rose from the grave. No, he rose from the dead in our hearts, right? He rose from the dead in our hearts, and therefore this isn't any threat to Rome. No. The followers of Jesus marched to their deaths. The evidence that we have from early church history is scant, but there's a little bit, and the evidence is that all 11 of Jesus's 12 disciples were killed for their testimony for Jesus. One who was not killed was the Apostle John, who wrote the Gospel of John, the letters, as well as Revelation, and he was boiled in oil, and it didn't kill him. And he was exiled to the island of Patmos in the Greek islands. I'm sure that John probably wished that it had worked, right? So I find this extremely compelling. I have yet to hear somebody present a counter argument. People will die for something that they think is true, but no one will die an awful death for something that they know is a lie. Now, can we agree on this? It's either true or it's false that Jesus rose from the dead, that his body was revivified a few days after his execution. And I want to ask you this question. Can you ever think of a time when a lie did more good than the truth? Can you? If this is a lie, if it's just baloney, the claim that Jesus rose from the dead, can you ever think of a time when a lie, in the long run, did more good than the truth? And I'll have to say that, speaking as a Christian, for all of our many imperfections, Christians have nevertheless, with God's power and by God's grace, been a source, a transformative force for good in the world. Been a lot of awful things done in the name of Christ. I won't deny that, but you can't just say it's all been bad. It's been incredibly good as well. There was a diplomat by the name of James Russell Lowell. He was a diplomat to England living in the late 19th century. And he said this in response to those who claimed that Christianity had not been good for the world. His words, I think, have some weight. I challenge any skeptic to find a 10 square mile spot on this planet where they can live their lives in peace and safety and decency, where womanhood is honored, where infancy and old age are revered, where they can educate their children, where the gospel of Jesus Christ has not gone first to prepare the way. If they find such a place, then I would encourage them to emigrate there and there proclaim their unbelief. If you have been overseas and not just to, Sandals, Jamaica or something like that, I mean, there is a huge amount of evil in the world. I mean, there's evil in America. Don't misunderstand me. But there's certain parts of the world where it's just a different level, where murder and massacre is just the warp and woof of day in, day out. I had a conversation that I will just never forget. When I was a pastor in Miami, a friend of mine was from Haiti, and there was a conversation where someone was griping about how horrible America is. And again, there's horrible things in America. I'm not going to deny that. But my friend from Haiti, he was just kind of shaking his head, chuckling. And I said to him, what is it? He said, man, you Americans, he said, y'all haven't really seen bad stuff. And I said, what have you got in mind, And he said, what was the leader of Haiti back in the 1980s? Papa Doc? Yeah. Okay. When he was in power, my friend was in elementary school, and he said, I'm seeing young children over here, so I have to be careful. But he said, I remember walking to school frequently and just seeing bodies hacked up on the side of the road that had been burnt alive, And there's a lot of evil in the world. There's a lot of evil here in America. And yet, I think the gospel of Jesus Christ has made a lot of nations in the West different from somewhere. It's just awfully grim. So the resurrection, I want to suggest, is more than just a historical fact. It gives both hope, but also a warning. Get that? The takeaway of the resurrection is hopeful, but there's also a warning. The hope is this, that Jesus' resurrection promises his followers hope. In John chapter 11, verses 25 and 26, Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. So it's like knowing Jesus, the one who conquered death, the one who rose from the dead. That has this ability to dissolve and conquer our fears as we think about our death someday. But it's also a warning. And the warning is that even though there is an incredible amount of evil, much of it just what we would call senseless evil in the world, nevertheless, Jesus Christ he's not only a savior, but he's also a judge. And he promises that one day he will judge the world. Remember I said the very first week, have you ever looked at something just terribly evil and said, why? Why, God, would you allow this to happen? Jesus says that one day he will judge the world. This is how the book of Acts puts it. God has fixed the day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Well, certain things demand a response, we might say. I'm not a big basketball fan. If you tell me something that happened in basketball, I'll be like, because I don't really understand the rules. It just looks like people doing the same thing, running back and forth. But I'm ignorant. I don't really, so I'm not going to respond very much if you talk about basketball. But if I'm standing in the middle of the road and a car is speeding toward me and you shout, get out of the way, you better believe I'm going to respond. And the resurrection of Jesus, the Bible's claim that he rose, that actually demands a response from us. And I think there's any number of possible responses that we can have to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Let's just look at this one, and it's the response of Jesus' disciple Thomas. You may remember this. We looked at it a few weeks ago. Doubting Thomas in John chapter 20. So the other disciples told Thomas, "We've seen the Lord," after he rose. But Thomas, he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." Then he, that is Jesus, a few days later, he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." And Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." That was Thomas's response to the resurrected Christ after he presumably put his hands into the marks where the nails had been. And the question for us is, how will we respond to Jesus' resurrection? Now, as amazing and I've learned tonight as confusing as the opening story was about Whitney and Lauren, the reality is that wasn't a resurrection, right? It wasn't a resurrection. It maybe felt like it to the families, but it was just a case of mistaken identity. And so Whitney's story is unique in that she will have two funerals, kind of like Lazarus, right? She'll have two funerals, a false funeral in 2006, and then her real funeral later on. See, Whitney, just like you and I, will eventually die. And we will have to stand before God, the judge of all, and give an account for our lives. And yet, in spite of that reality, because of Jesus' resurrection, that doesn't have to be fearful. There's hope in Jesus because he's risen from the dead. And as one author put it, what does this mean? It means that all of the pain that you've experienced, the tears that you have shed, the losses that you have experienced will one day come untrue because of the resurrection. And so with that, I'm happy to take your questions. Do I have baskets? Are there baskets circulating? Wonderful. All right, let's see what you've got for me tonight. I spoke with someone today and he said, "I have a question. You want me to ask it now?" And I said, "I like to be put on the spot. So hold it and I'll take it later." All right, let's see. First question is, when you go into heaven, what could it be like? Well, we don't know what it will be like specifically. We know a few things. I'll give you some hints, whoever asked this very good question. We know that when we are in heaven, and heaven is for those who have been good. I hope you know that by now. Heaven isn't for good people. It's for forgiven people, right? We will see God face to face. That's what Revelation chapter 22, verse 4 says, that those who are in the new city we will get to see the face of God. And the Bible suggests that in itself will be so wonderful and so ravishing that we won't be interested in doing much else. I think that's the picture that the Bible gives. And if that sounds boring to you, and if you're like, church service, boring. Am I going to have to wear a suit and a tie, Sounds horrible. Are we gonna have to sing hymns, If it sounds boring to you to see God face to face, then it can only be because you don't know him. You don't know him. And that's why it sounds boring. But there's a verse in this letter called 1 Corinthians that we looked at earlier, remember? And it says that, it's 1 Corinthians 2:9 says that no eye has seen, no ear has heard, and it's never entered into the heart of anybody what God has prepared for those who love him. So when you imagine what heaven is like, don't think that it's like going to the Willy Wonka chocolate factory and just drinking gallons of chocolate and eating food and being in the mountains or the beach, if that's your thing. If you actually like getting sand everywhere and you're crazy and you like the beach, whatever, Like if you add all of those, any other pleasures and feel good that you can imagine and try to put them all together and say, this is what heaven's like. The Bible says that's not what heaven. No eye has seen it, no ear has heard it. It's never even entered into the heart of any human being what God has prepared for those who love him. So we don't know much about heaven, but we know that we will be with the Lord. And that's the great prize of heaven, is to get God forever. Oh, this is a great question. All right, next question. Why do some accounts, Luke versus Mark, say that there were two angels and others say there was only one at Jesus' tomb? Does this mean that the Bible is inconsistent? It's a very good question. In Mark, it says there's one young man who's there clothed in white, remember? And then Luke actually says two things, and I already addressed this if you were paying careful attention earlier. At the first part of Luke chapter 24, it says that there were two men. So it mentions the two men. And you're thinking, okay, where's the angel? And then when the women who see the two men, presumably, we know it was at least Mary Magdalene and Mary, who I believe was actually Jesus' mother at the tomb, that when they went back and reported to the disciples this meeting of the two men, they didn't say we met two men. They said that they had seen a vision of angels. So I don't think that's contradictory at all. In fact, Luke makes sense of it right there. But I mean, there's an example where if you just read something, just kind of, read through it quickly, you might think that, well, this is contradictory. But I don't think that it is, because angels very often will take on a bodily form in the Bible. And so Luke right there shows us that in the same breath, really, you have two men who are called angels. This vision of angels. Now, is it a contradiction to say that you saw one person and not mention that there were actually two there? Is that necessarily a contradiction? I don't think it is. We need to be clear on exactly what a contradiction is. If one account said that there was one person there, and then another one says that there were two people there, is that necessarily a contradiction? It's not necessarily. It might be that this one just mentioned that there was one, and the other mentioned that there was two. Now, if this one said that there was only one, and this one said that there were two, that would be a contradiction. Okay? Let me put it to you this way. If I go on run an errand, and let's say I go up to Butler's Crossing and I go to Publix, and when I'm there, I see my wife Nicole and my friend Elise. And I see both of them at Publix. And then I come back to church and I see someone else, and you all, I hope know. Elise, will you raise your hand? Elise just kind of does all these important things at church, and is a great blessing to our church. So anyway, let's say that I see my wife and I see Elise, and they're both they're at Publix or something like that. And then I come back to church and I'm speaking with somebody else in the office, and I say, hey, I just ran into Elise at Publix. Did I lie? Did I lie that I saw Elise? No, I just didn't mention that I also saw my wife, right? Okay, so does that make sense? So now, here's the thing I don't know. I don't know why it is that Mark mentioned one and Luke mentioned that there were two. But do your best to try to determine, like, well, is this contradictory that one said one and the other said two? Because I'm not convinced that it is. Okay. This is very good. Third question: what historical record is there other than the Bible of Jesus's miracles and resurrection? The answer is that there are not. There are not, outside of the gospel accounts. However, when we pick this Bible up, we think of this as being this is one book, right? This is one account. Well, it's actually not. I mean, it's 66 different books, speaking with a unified, coherent voice. But when we get to the sections, to the books called Gospels, we have not one account of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. We have 4 accounts of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And Professor Bruce Metzger, who was a conservative Bible scholar at Princeton University, if you know anything about Princeton, then that should make your jaw drop. But he was very conservative theologically and was arguably the greatest textual scholar of the Bible in the 20th century. I would say that he was that. And Bruce Metzger actually argues that not only were there 4 accounts of the resurrection of Jesus, but there's actually a 5th account, and that would be the long ending of Mark. I won't go into the long ending of Mark right now, but that would be Mark chapter 16, verses 8 through 16, I believe it is. So in other words, don't think of the Bible as the Gospels as one source. It's actually 4 sources, and that's the reason that there are differences. But getting back to this question, outside of the accounts of what we know as being the Bible, there are not accounts of his miracles. There's a passage in Josephus where Josephus supposedly wrote something about Jesus of Nazareth, who is a man, quote unquote, if we could call him that. And so there, 20, 30 years ago, Christians would be like, look, Josephus says that, okay, Jesus, he was more than just a man, but textually, I don't accept that. There's evidence that was a later addition to Josephus's writings. So I'm very comfortable standing on these four accounts called the Gospels, and to say this is what we have. Let me suggest something to you. If in your heart of hearts you don't want to accept that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and that he really is Lord and God, then you wouldn't accept if there were 100 independent accounts of Jesus Christ. There's a very profound saying that goes like this: intent precedes content. Your intention, your motivation, that comes prior to the content, the material that you read about Jesus, these accounts of his resurrection. And so I want to challenge you to consider, what is your intention? What is your motivation? Can you say that you really are open-minded to pick up this book and read through it and see what you will make of Jesus? But if you pick up this book and you just say, oh, boring, stupid, made-up lies, and if you have that presupposition, these are just boring, stupid, made-up lies, then no matter how much you read, what conclusion will you necessarily arrive at? What? This is all boring, stupid, made-up lies. So sometimes I challenge people, hey, you know what? Just pick up the Bible and don't just automatically believe it. Don't just accept it by blind faith. But on the other hand, don't just reject it because you're not open to what it has to say. And I think that God might do for you what he did for me and what I think he's done for all Christians. That as you pick up and read this, it's almost like a light switch sometimes will flip on. And before, when you read the Bible, you read it and you just kind of say, like, yeah, okay, that's cool. Some stories that are hard to believe. It kind of sounds like a fairy tale, but okay, this is good. And then God sometimes will change something in you. And then all of a sudden you read it and you just say, oh my gosh, this is incredible. Like this was written for me. It's like being in a dark room and feeling around. You can't find your way. And you don't know what anything is. And how helpful isn't it when someone comes in and flips the light on and you see everything? That's what God does if you're willing to pick up and read his word. So I'll leave you with this homework. Okay. Next week, I'm going to challenge you to read just one time. Well, you can read it more than once, but at least one time. read the Gospel of John. That's my favorite gospel. I love it. I love it. Read the Gospel of John. And again, don't just with blind faith believe everything you read, but don't just with blind faith disbelieve. Come to it with an open mind and ask God, say, God, God, if this is true, then I want to hear from you in this book. All right, well, that's my best shot. Anybody have any questions who didn't get a chance to write them down or come back? Yes, Brett. I'm sorry, could you say that? Yes. Yeah. Let me think. I'll have to get back with you about resources. This is something, kind of how we got the Bible is something that I've studied a good bit. It was something that kind of troubled me because I'm like, I don't really know how we got the Bible, So in terms of like how the canon formed and textual criticism and things like that is something that I can definitely give you, like a reading list or something like that. The short answer is that all 4 of the Gospels are anonymous. I don't know if you knew that. When Matthew wrote the Gospel we call Matthew, he didn't write Matthew across the top of it. There are hints, however, like in the Gospel of John, it says the one who wrote these words testifies, and the evidence is that, for example, John was that one. What happened though in church history is from a pretty early date, the early Christians, they assigned, we might say they attached names to the Gospels because as the Gospels circulated, people knew that Mark wrote this one, John, Luke wrote this one, that kind of thing. So the answer is that from an early date, the Gospels were identified with some of the early followers of Christ. But like I say, I'm happy to get you I can give you a good reading list if you want. So, yeah, okay. I think we had 2 questions, Chris, and then Lauren. I think you were next. Michael Krueger, kind of like Freddy, only Michael. Yeah, little different. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. You're exactly right. He's one of the top. I would say he's one of the top scholars in the world today that focuses on these questions. Yeah, Kruger. So, Chris, yes.
You asked us to read the Gospel of John before. We don't have one of these. Can we take one of the ones on the table?
Yes, you may. Great question. If anybody, if you don't have a Bible, then consider this a gift from our church to you. And this one, I like it because it's just big. It has large print. Okay, I'm old. That's why. Yeah. So, all right. Thank you. We have one more question. Sarah, you get the last question.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
It's actually just kind of, but so can you explain again like why
very often when the empire, when soldiers would kill people, it would crucify people. It would usually take more than a day, sometimes take as many as 2 or 3 days. When a person was crucified, it's kind of gory, but this is just the truth. When a person was crucified, they did not die from their blood, being let out, but they actually suffocated. So in this kind of a position, your diaphragm is open, and the stronger you are, the longer you live, because you can raise yourself up and exhale, or rather get another breath. And so, I mean, you had a slave who was very, very strong. Poor guy he could hang out there in the sun for a few days before he died. And so that was why, do you remember there's a place where he gives the command to break their legs? The way that they would expedite a crucifixion, the execution, was they would take a stick or whatever and smash their legs. Someone with broken legs is not going to be able to live nearly as long as somebody with their legs intact. And that's why when they went to Jesus to break his legs, they realized they didn't need to because he was already dead. And the spear went in his side, and blood and water, the platelets had separated out, indicating he had died. So I think that's the reason for it. They cracked the legs of the thieves, and they passed away. But he was like it usually takes longer than this. And when you do read the account of the treatment of Jesus beforehand, it goes a long way to explaining why it was that Jesus died as quickly as he did. If any of you ever saw The Passion of the Christ, I mean, it's a horrific depiction, but it's pretty accurate. That was what happened to him. Yeah. So, yeah. Thank you all so much for coming. As my friend Chris said, if you don't have a Bible, take one of those. It's our gift to you. And I look forward to seeing you all next week, and we'll have our last class. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of my story, and we'll kind of conclude things. So I hope to see you all then.